Hello, everybody. Again, this is just one part in a four-part series. I encourage all of you to watch all four parts because, like I always say, the most shocking stuff is always in the fourth part. It's at the end of the full version video because I do a building block, laying a foundation sort of process, the way that I process my thoughts. So it's not to bait people or anything like that, but the most shocking stuff in this particular video is about the Kinsey Institute and the crimes they committed against children. And it's absolutely mind-blowing, and everybody in America should know about it. Really, everybody worldwide, because Alfred Kinsey went around the world, traveled around the world, and testified to the governments of the world as some sort of expert. And so, as you'll see in this video, many of the laws of our nations, the laws that rule over us, are because of this one psychopath, Alfred Kinsey. But I also encourage you not to skip forward past the first three parts of the series because they show the impact in today's society of what happened when we followed his advice and his sexual revolution. And it has led to crimes against humanity in untold ways. So I know this seminar is about the transgender movement, but please stick around to the end because this is going to tie together everything that this video has been about. And these same players you'll see financed by the Rockefellers, they were sexual monsters. They were literal pedophile sexual psychopaths that tortured babies sexually as young as 2 months old to get data that they said were having orgasms. 2-month-old babies were having orgasms and stuff. It's just absolutely horrific what went on at the Kinsey Institute. So please stick around till the end and hear me out because this is something that needs to come to light. We've had the government make apologies for the Tuskegee experiments and different things that they've done on unwitting American citizens, but we have never had an apology for what Kinsey did. Quite the opposite. They are still teaching Kinsey in the universities, in our grade school sex ed classes. It's time. Where's the Me Too movement? Where's the Me Too movement on this? They should be lobbying every single school board, every university, because Kinsey actually wrote in his book that is being taught to our children that there's nothing wrong with rape, that people who get raped actually enjoy it. So this is the expert that we are still teaching. This is the father of the pansexual movement, the homosexual movement, the transgender movement. He went around to all of the governments of the world as the expert to change their sex laws. He changed law in our country. He affected Planned Parenthood, the Roe versus Wade case. His data was cited in. So this goes way beyond just him falsifying data. He was a psychopathic monster. And we can see the manifestation of his influence. Our children are being created in his image and our laws also. So please do stick around to the end, even if you're not interested in the trans agenda, because there's a lot more going on here.
I'm a pediatric endocrinologist who practices in private practice in Atlanta. I'm on the clinical faculty of 2 medical school pediatric departments in Atlanta. Love teaching, love clinical practice. I've been an endocrinologist for 38 years. Excuse me, 38 years. I've been practicing pediatrics for 42 years. So my experience in transgender medicine goes all the way back to my fellowship days at Johns Hopkins, where I trained. And I'll start discussing the issue looking backwards at the history of transgender medicine as it has unfolded in the United States. I refer to the 3 Musketeers, Alfred Kinsey. He was not a physician. He had a degree of science in entomology, which is the study of insects. He started, because of his interest in sex, at the Kinsey Institute in 1947. John Money, who was a psychologist, trained, graduated from Harvard, and joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins as a clinical psychologist in 1951. I read a little bit of his biographical statement about his relationship with Johns Hopkins as a young person. And he was not a physician, did not go to medical school, but he did say he spent Saturdays in the pediatric endocrine clinic for a year And as far as he was concerned, he was better trained than most pediatric endocrinologists. So he visioned himself as a medical physician and an expert in the field, even though he had no formal training. And then Harry Benjamin, who I originally had assumed was a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Turns out he was a general medicine physician who also had a whole lot of interest in things related to sex, and he had a private practice that failed a number of times. It finally took hold in New York City, and he would go to San Francisco in the summer and practice there.
Now notice again, he said New York and San Francisco, all the way back then, these communities. I mean, everybody's always kind of had a running joke about San Francisco being the homosexual capital of the world, but truly, there are communities, pockets of these people who indulge in this sexual perversion. Here's little Desmond. These are the very same locations that we see them launching this new thing. They want us to normalize and accept the sexual exploitation of these little boys that they dress up in makeup. And look, this is showtime's 11:30 at night. And they dress these little children up, little boys up in makeup, and then drag them in the middle of the night to put on these sexual performances for these grown men and women, for that matter. San Francisco and New York, again and again. This is the Oasis in San Francisco. And in New York, it was the gay bar, the $3 bill.
So John Money decided lots of things. He had lots of ideas in his head, and he thought that gender was going to be used as a term to show the internal sexed self as either male or female. So it was taken out of the linguistic world in the 1950s and 60s and placed as a term in the field of identifying human beings and their gender orientation. He had trained in Boston and was intrigued by the opportunity to study patients that had issues with sexual differentiation, so-called hermaphrodites or pseudo-hermaphrodites. And at Johns Hopkins, at that time, it was sort of the place where steroid biochemistry was being unfolded, and the concept of how cortisol was made and how the offshoots of the steroid hormones are developed in the adrenal gland, and what mistakes in nature happened to cause what we now call disorders of sexual differentiation. So most of the patients in the United States, and actually from around the world, were referred to Baltimore to be evaluated for what caused their disorder of sexual differentiation. And this is a very tiny fraction of patients. We're not talking about hundreds and thousands. We're talking about initially 10 or 12 patients that were studied, just to look at why the accident of nature happened and what the consequences were on physical exam. So John Money thought, well, there is an opportunity for me, as an interested psychologist, to look at the concept of where one perceives their gender and if social circumstances can change a person's gender successfully. So that he decided he was drawn to Johns Hopkins as a result. So he joined the faculty and established protocols to evaluate these kids, both pre-treatment and post-treatment, and to see what happened in patients with abnormal anatomy or early or delayed puberty. So he developed, at the same time, an adult transsexual program, and it was not called transgender then, it was called transsexual. These were adult patients who believed they were born into the wrong body, and they were recruited through newspapers locally and regionally through the grapevine. There was no internet back then. And they had cross-dressed these individuals in their intended new gender for 2 years. That was the social transition phase first. And then they administered cross-sex hormones subsequently if they had been able to succeed in their new gender role in the workplace and at home socially. They did not have puberty blockers because these were all adults who had already been through puberty. The surgical procedures then to alter their genitalia were developed, and they actually, in the process of learning on big people, the surgeons translated that down to surgeries that could be done on infants and toddlers who had abnormal genitalia that needed correction. So there was a spin-off from the adult program that worked its way down through pediatric surgeons and subspecialists. So this is one of the patients that changed from male to female. We, as pediatric endocrine fellows, unfortunately, were the ones that had to follow these patients into their adulthood, even though they weren't pediatric patients. So Don Trella, as you might have guessed, had a day job, and it wasn't a particularly socially acceptable one. Money's scientific protocols. He had an idea, and he says, he would actually call up and say, I've been thinking, I have a really neat idea. And then he would say, let's do something to the patient and see how it comes out. Now, this sounds bizarre in an era where we are so intent on following good science, but that's as far as his science went. So John Money decided he was one of the leaders in medical castration of sex criminals. The only drug that we had at the time that would work was medroxyprogesterone, long-acting, or so-called Depo-Medrol, or rather Depo-Provera. And that was given to incarcerated individuals in prisons that had been sex offenders to see whether or not they could control their sexual urges.
Okay, now notice that he said Depo-Provera was the hormone used to chemically castrate these sex offenders. And this is of the utmost importance to understand because Depo-Provera is one of the most common birth control drugs given to women nowadays. I've had the Depo-Provera shot back when I was on birth control when I was a young woman. This is super common birth control, considered a contraceptive that's being distributed through Planned Parenthood and really just about any doctor's office. Now, the reason that this is so important to us as a human civilization is because all of these birth control drugs that they've been passing out since the sexual revolution are going into our toilets and our toilet water and passing through our bodies and going back into our water supplies. And there have been incredible studies on the municipal water supplies of New York and how many of these hormones are in the water supply that's coming out of people's taps. Because the water treatment facilities are focused on killing, bacteria and things like that to make the water supply clean. But they have absolutely no process in place that removes all of these hormones and all of these different drugs that are flushed down the toilet and all of that. So these hormones that they have flooded our culture with since the 1970s have flooded our water supplies. Parents who don't breastfeed, they'll go get their baby formula and they'll just add some tap water to it and stick it in their little boy's mouth. And what happens from that is exactly what he just said. Depo-Provera given to little boys causes chemical castration. And surely you can see, just by looking around, go anywhere and look at our young men now compared to the young men of the 1940s and 50s. Look at the young men and you'll see, it's pretty tough to find a guy with some bass in his voice, is all I'm saying. And it goes well beyond just the effeminate nature that we're seeing spring up biologically. Like I talked about in the last couple videos, the lowered sperm counts. This is about the extinction of the human race, population control. Sperm counts dropping at a rate of 50% and more. This is dire. So I don't have time to cover all of these studies in this video, but you can just do a quick search. Right here is Live Science. Water pollution caused by birth control poses dilemma. Low sperm counts. Birth control and drinking water, a fertility catastrophe. People trying to fight this. Scientific American, can birth control hormones be filtered from the water? The decline in male fertility linked to water pollution. So you can just go through, please do the search. This is very real. What he's telling you, they knew caused chemical castration in sex offenders back in the 60s, now is being given to all of our male children in the water supply. Okay, let's keep going.
Then there's a case that I took care of a child named David who came down from Buffalo, New York to our clinic because he had what was called a micropenis, a very, very tiny phallic structure and no palpable testicles in the scrotum. We evaluated this child at age 6 weeks, and we decided we would put this child through a protocol, which it was to use a hormone that would stimulate the testicles to produce testosterone. In doing so, we would find out if the baby did have testicles, and after that, we'd find out if the testicles produced testosterone, would the baby's penis grow and would the tissue respond? All those things were very important for us to know in terms of figuring out what this child should be raised, either a boy or a girl. So unbeknownst to us, John Money we thought he was out of the country, but he actually had come back early from a tour somewhere, and he interviewed this family without our knowing it before the family left home and told the mother and the grandmother that what we were doing with hormones was absolute nonsense. There was no possible way that the child was going to be able to be raised as a boy because nothing we could do would fix that. So he sent the baby home with the mother and the grandmother, telling them to change the name, and they chose Tabitha, and to cross-dress the baby as a girl. 6 weeks later, the baby came back for us to evaluate the baby, and the baby, Tabitha, had a normal-sized penis and testicles down in the scrotum, indicating clearly that it was just a boy with a pituitary deficiency and not somebody that needed to have their sex changed. It was that particular case that sort of ended the relationship of John Money with the Pediatric Endocrine Division at Johns Hopkins, and later they closed his program down. So the suicide, that boy with a ablated penis who was raised as a female, what this showed was this is a boy who was in utero, had all the XY chromosome information that said every cell of his body is male. He had the hormones that bathe his brain because there was no problem of hormone deficiency. His testosterone programmed his system from the beginning. He was changed into a girl surgically as a costume. And he knew throughout his young childhood that something was not right. And when his parents finally fessed up and told him what the story was, he insisted that he be changed as a young teenager back to a boy. And he assumed that role. And then he committed suicide. That made headlines across the country, and that was sort of the last nail in the coffin for John Money and his crazy ideas. So the interesting thing about the disorders of sexual differentiation, and I, as a fellow, had learned that if you had a baby that looked completely feminized or non-virilized, there was no possible way that that child could be reared as a male. It would have to be reared as a female. The study of long-term follow-up of these patients, there were 16 of them. 2 of them ended up remaining as they were natally, as males. The parents did not want any surgery or any correction. Of the 14 that did, 8 ended up growing back up and reclaiming their natal sex as a male. So even with our well-intentioned ideas based on the concept that gender is your natal sex is not innate, that there's gender that can be changed by society, it turned out that was not the case.
But what I wanted to point out right here is that there was a split back in the early days of this transsexual medicine between people who were just completely unscientific and just wanted to use babies as guinea pigs and do all this surgical mutilation on them, and an actual scientific community that wanted to treat patients. And the real scientific community immediately found out that, yes, of course, what you do is you treat the patient. If somebody has a physical deformity, you try and correct that with surgery, meaning if their penis is not fully developed or their testicles haven't dropped, then you treat that with hormones and help them finish developing. And even in tragic cases, like he talked about the child who had the penis was amputated, that they could use prosthetics and surgery to recreate that child, help him live his life out the best he could. But instead, there were these wacko quacks on the other side that were like, instead of helping that child with prosthetics or help them finish developing, no, we'll just change their sex. That's the answer, right? And so these children were tortured. They were boys who never had a say in it, that as babies, these wacko doctors are like, hey, instead of trying to help them develop their male genitalia, we'll just turn them into a girl. And of course, they found, as they tracked these patients throughout their development and their lifetime into adults, that you can't do that. That's impossible. That every cell in their body was male and their brain system was still male and all of that. So these patients who were sexually mutilated and changed into girls instead of helped, they ended up, a lot of them, committing suicide. That just putting a costume on these humans and saying, oh, well, you're a different sex now because you had a deformity, it was catastrophic psychologically and physically. In fact, more than half, 8 of the 14 patients that they had transgendered demanded when they grew up that they be transitioned back to their regular sex as best as they could, because they had already been mutilated. But it was the only option they had, because they said they could not live with being forced to pretend to be a gender that they're not. So Johns Hopkins even closed that quack science programs because it was proven that they weren't helping these people, these patients, achieve their gender identity. In fact, they had forced them against their will to pretend for years to be a gender that they were not and did not identify as. But the patients treated with real medical science, who were allowed to finish developing and all that, had an amazing almost 100% success rate, 80 to 98% success rate, and led happy lives. But the sad thing is that as we go through this, you will see that Dr. Zucker's and the actual scientific research was systematically removed from all of the peer review articles, and it was replaced by fraudulent data from these sexual psychopaths and pedophiles, which is what has led to what we are now calling the transpocalypse.
Paul McHugh, who had joined the faculty at Johns Hopkins a long time before and who became the psychiatrist in chief in 1974, closed down all of the efforts at Hopkins that had been started by John Money. So if we look at transgender clinical services over the decades before 2006, in the Netherlands, they had adults that persisted with gender identity, and they were treated with medicine to transform their physical appearance to the opposite sex, and they were also treated surgically. In Toronto, Dr. Kenneth Zucker, who was a psychologist, had a large series of patients who he counseled through their gender identity crisis and got them to be essentially returned to their natal sex in 98% of the cases in boys and upwards of 80+% in females. It is that classic work, that long, hard 35 to 40 year experience of his patients in Toronto that gives us the strong statistics about the existence of the transgender identity. Then he had experience with greater than 500 patients, 560 patients to be exact. Then in Boston, Dr. Norman Spack, who had taken a trip over to the Netherlands, he was sort of fascinated with the transgender idea. And he went to the big clinics in the Netherlands where this had been in practice for a number of years. And he thought this would be a great idea to start in the United States. And so he came back to Boston and started what was the first East Coast Transgender Center in 2006. So in 2006, there were basically two places in the country where if you had transgender issues as a patient, you could be referred to the experts, since Baltimore was gone. And that was in Boston and then eventually in Los Angeles.
Okay, now make note how fast this happened, because a lot of people born into this transpocalypse, especially young people, think, oh, it's always been this way. Everybody's always been sexually confused and gender confusion and self-mutilating and all this, but that's not true. The first clinic was opened in 2006. One clinic opened in 2006. At least that one was by a doctor. Because after that, they started an organization to recruit people who just wanted to promote this type of thing. They didn't have to have any medical background or anything.
Now, there's a group called the Harry Benjamin Society, named after that infamous character who was one of the three Musketeers sexologists. Its membership requirements are very, very strict. You have to be interested in transgenderism. That's it. You do not have to be trained in medicine. You do not have to be, all you have to do is say, I'm really a proponent of transgenderism. And you sign up and you get in as a membership. That's a professional society, supposedly, and there is no requirements for specific education or professional background.
These groups who have absolutely no medical training, bam, 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 just started opening up transgender clinics to perform these surgeries on people all across the United States. And really, this is worldwide. This has happened worldwide. And further, the organization, the WPATH organization who did all of this, yeah, their logo is the MK Ultra butterfly. So they took the MK Ultra Monarch program and they painted the butterfly in the rainbow, and they started this association that opened these clinics. Outright MK Ultra mind control programming of the masses, which I'll go into more when we go into the Kinsey Institute programs. So we went from the actual medical studies where worldwide there were only a few hundred, maybe a few thousand people worldwide who had actual biological gender issues and hormone issues and stuff that needed to be treated, to this. Just millions upon millions of our boys. I'm a woman now. I'm a woman. 10 tips on changing from a boy to a girl. I'm a woman, transition, all these are all of our sons. Millions upon millions upon millions. Here's dating in stealth, how you can be a boy and dress like a girl and even trick other boys into making out with you. These are our sons. These are our male children who have fallen prey to this fraud and social engineering program. They think they're hipster. They think, hey, they're so progressive and cool. They have fallen prey to this cabal, this elite marketing of androgyny as the guiding principle of the new age. It's in all of their books. This is that Age of Deceit, the first transagenda video. I show you the actual books, the authors, table of contents, androgyny as the guiding principle of the new age. These are the occult Satanist books. These are their books. They say it openly that we're going to make your children into our image of this satanic cabal. And that's exactly what we see. All these people, they think they're so hipster, they're so cutting edge, and they're slaves. They're just mind control slaves. They're brainwashed people in a cult, in a sex cult. It's unbelievable. And all of this is led by people who have absolutely no medical background. And the social engineering trap was sprung, bam. When I was a kid, before 2006, this didn't exist. But in just one decade, now our children can't figure out if they're a boy or a girl. They're all neutered. They need gender neutral bathrooms. And at the very same time that they started setting up all these counseling clinics and advertising on the internet and everything in the 2000s to bring in all of these people and tell them their fraudulent science and convince them to succumb to these self-mutilation surgeries and these hormone treatments and stuff, that at the very same time, one arm of this militant movement started banning all opposing viewpoints. So that's what this law in California, here's a video that I did about it. If you want to know what the law is and listen to the counselors and listen to the facts about it, please go watch this 29-minute video. But what it boils down to is conversion therapy. They have labeled science, real science, like I just showed you from Dr. Zucker and Canada, and all of the real science that has been taken out of the medical journals, they have labeled that conversion therapy. And they say, oh, conversion therapy is detrimental to people. So you can't even tell them that they have options. They have to come to our transgender clinics and get, I just showed you the science. I just showed you the doctor telling you that the science that they're promoting is completely false data. And I'm getting ready to show you the Kinsey Institute data, which is 1,000 times worse. But it doesn't matter because they've set up a propaganda network of counseling clinics across the United States and around the world saying that, well, we have the answer. You have to succumb to our therapies. And anybody, again, like a cult, anybody who tells you any different is harmful to you. They're your enemy. Don't listen to the Christians or to any counselor who tells you that you can actually live in your own biological body. They tell them it's impossible. And in fact, if you try to overcome same-sex attraction or anything like that, that falls under conversion therapy and it must be banned. Therefore, all of the Christian counselors must be shut down because they're telling you that you can overcome same-sex attraction the same way they teach married couples don't cheat on each other. You can overcome adultery. You know, that's like saying all males should just start humping like monkeys and cheating on their wives and everything every day because males have attractions to other women or whatever. They're saying that we can't, Christians should not be allowed to say you can actually practice temperance and self-control and not be a beast or an animal. But they haven't gone that far yet with adultery. We can tell heterosexual men not to act on heterosexual attractions, that might destroy your family and that's psychologically traumatizing to your partner. We can say that in heterosexual circumstances, but they have actually crafted legal bills, actual legislation to make it criminal, a crime for a Christian to tell a homosexual that you can exercise temperance and not act on same-sex attractions. This is really happening, and this is the first step in the Bible banning. because of all the Bible verses that say that people were delivered from homosexuality in the Bible. It clearly says that right here in 1 Corinthians 6. Go down to like verse 9. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves will inherit the kingdom of God. But here's the good news. Here's the conversion therapy. But such were some of you. But you were washed, and you were sanctified, and you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and in the Spirit of our God. And of course, that's what we see in real life. I have tons of videos on my channel. Here's one, delivered from homosexuality, 4 testimonies set free by Jesus Christ. These people who had an actual spiritual rebirth experience, like all of us have. We all had sin. We were fornicators. I mean, think about it. We've all been led astray into this sexual revolution. I mean, back in my parents' generation, yeah, people stayed married for life. My parents have celebrated their 50th anniversary a couple years ago and stuff. They stay together for life. But nowadays, no, the divorce rate's, you know what, 60, 70%. And how many of you can honestly say, I'm not asking you to write it down in the comments and confess publicly, but can say you've never fornicated, that you've never slept with a single person outside of marriage? No, generally speaking, our society, since the sexual revolution, they just hump like monkeys. If you go out on a date, it's like, hey, let's go out and eat some spaghetti and then we'll, have sex. Or even worse, it's what do they call it, or used to call it? I'm kind of out of date now, but friends with benefits or hookups. Like, we don't even have to date. We don't even have to like each other. Let's just get together and use each other's bodies. So, this sexual sin is not just homosexuality, it's all of us. And so we know we've been delivered, and now we act like civilized, decent humans now. Since my husband left me, I'm abstinent. I don't have to go out and hook up with strangers or anything. That's ridiculous. There's more to life than playing with your genitals. I mean, come on. But in the homosexual community, these people, see, these are homosexuals right here saying this video is them in their own words. It's not me putting words in their mouth. This is them, homosexuals, saying, this is my experience, and I was transformed and set free. I found out that I was deceived and all of this. But that's the problem with the propaganda network, is even homosexuals, they say, oh, well, you're a hater if you won't let homosexuals express themselves. Well, here's homosexuals who want to express themselves and tell you that conversion therapy not only works, but they've never been happier and healthier, and they're so excited they want to tell others about it. So the LGBT community says these people shouldn't have a voice. So it's not about rights for LGBT people, because there's tons of LGBT people who want to tell you about conversion therapy and tell you about freedom through Jesus Christ. But they don't want that. They want to silence homosexuals and make sure the homosexuals cannot express themselves unless they are parroting exactly what the propaganda network tells them is sanctioned speech. And over here at our #Jesus channel, where we have all of the testimonies, there's some powerful testimonies. Here's an ex-lesbian, the editor of Venus magazine, and a gay rights activist. And she got saved and set free and became a reverend and gave her testimony everywhere, completely set free. There's tons of, here's another one. There's tons of testimonies on here from homosexuals who, they call it conversion therapy. We call it being born again. In Ken Davies' testimony in that other video, he actually says his spiritual encounter when he got set free, he visibly saw a demon leave him, and he explains what it felt like, what it looked like. And he says when it left him, immediately all of those desires went with it that he thought were his desires. And that's what we've talked about in the trans agenda video, that they want us. That's the whole thing. That's what they want, is bodies. That's what the breeding program is about. They want bodies. They can't interact with this dimension unless they do it through a 3-dimensional being, a body, a person. And that's exactly what Ken experienced. He said when it left him, all of those desires went with it. He couldn't believe it. He had never, because he was that way from childhood. He had never experienced life without that thing on him. So he was just absolutely amazed. It wasn't a struggle like, I'm resistant, I'm trying to be good, I'm not going to act on that. No, the desires left when the parasite left, when the evil spirit left. And that's not just a homosexual thing. You guys know, we talk about it on this channel all the time. When we got born again and our vessels were cleansed, our bodies were cleansed of all those parasites, all of those evil entities that had attached themselves to us over the years, uh, all of our desires changed. Like I talk about, I couldn't read the Bible. I could not physically read it. I couldn't care less. I couldn't read more than a couple of lines without falling asleep or just blah. And my desires changed. When I received the Holy Spirit, I was voraciously hungry. I couldn't put it down. I was like, this is the most interesting, fascinating thing I've ever read. And I would get chills when I read it. I was just like, this is amazing. There's an actual change in your thoughts when you go through that spiritual change and your desires change. We always talk about how we all turned off the TV or threw away all of our pop culture music and stuff because our desires, we didn't desire it anymore. We weren't doing it like, because I'm going to be good and I'm going to stop listening to that. No, we quit because we didn't desire it anymore. We didn't like it. Our actual taste changed. And that's exactly what Ken Davies describes with homosexuality. He said when that entity left, it took all that with it. Those thoughts he thought were his. He had been convinced by this LGBT community that these were his thoughts and you could never change and you're born this way. And he was shocked to find out that those were never his thoughts, that he was actually allowing this other person, a disembodied spirit, to live through him in his vessel with him. So that's what they don't want you to know. That's why they ban the Bible. It's why they ban prayer. It's why they label it conversion therapy, to tell somebody what I just said right here, which probably won't be able to do legally for very long if they have anything to say about it. So they're saying that we can't read the Bible to these people or tell them that there is any other way than what this sex cult tells them. Legally, they want to make it a crime for people to hear anything besides what the sex cult has to say to them. And again, like my personal testimony earlier, where I told you this is exactly what they did to my ex-husband, to isolate him and cut him off from his family and loved ones so that they had total control over his mind. And this is one of those things. I am not making this up. I swear to God, God is my witness. Out of his own mouth, this is one of the things he said. Conversion therapy doesn't work. It makes people commit suicide. He said that. Everything out of his mouth is a regurgitation. He's like a parrot. Polly, want a cracker? Polly, want a cracker? Everything out of his mouth is straight out of this literature, which I'm showing you now is a propaganda network that completely contradicts medical science. But they don't know that because they're trying to make it a crime for us to even speak the truth.
WPATH is not happy with the existing medical literature. The studies we had from Kenneth Zucker with his greater than 500 patients showed that desistance of transgenderism was prevalent if you let these kids go through puberty naturally. That's a large number of patients, 560 to be studied over all those years. And then the study from Sweden, which is a country which has been very permissive and very accepting socially of transgender patients into adulthood, published a study of 330 plus patients, or 324 patients, of transgendered adults who persisted into adulthood and had been treated either with medication or medication and surgery. And their data showed that there was a 20-fold increase in suicide in those patients compared to the non-transgender community. That blows it out of the water. This is not something you can sweep under the rug as a poor study, poorly conceived. It was every single patient, like it or not, was included in the study. And again, the same thing with Dr. Zucker's study. He did not exclude a single one of his patients from the database. So the WPATH, in order to get around this kind of powerful research and experience, creates its own bibliography. The quality of the studies that they research are poor for a number of reasons. They're very, very small numbers, studies of as little as 5 patients. The recruitment is based on people saying, we're going to publish a study about how you're doing as a transgender. Please contact us if you're interested. Okay, now, in a society where if you're not happy with your transgender self, you are going to be ostracized and receive death threats, you're not probably going to raise your hand and come to that study and be recruited. You're going to sit quietly and say absolutely nothing about how miserable you are. So it's a biased population. I want all happy people to raise their hands. Okay, all happy people raise your hands. Are you happy? Gosh, 100% correlation. Okay, so it's like the silliest thing in the world to call that good science. We don't do that with other areas. There are no control groups in their studies. Very, very few of them, if any, have anything that could be considered a study where they had a treated arm and an untreated arm in the study and compared the outcomes. They also use recycling of the same information. Somebody will write an article in a journal that is perhaps based on some kind of competent research or incompetent research, and then that will be quoted, and then that will be rewritten into an article in what we call a throwaway journal, which is a journal that basically does, articles, sort of summary articles for people who are interested in the field but are not specializing in that field, and they want to know a little bit about it. And in pediatrics, Pediatric News is one of those, or Pediatric Annals, or Contemporary Pediatrics. These are not journals that have peer review with the kind of restrictions for the scientific journals. They're basically sort of like a throwaway rag at the grocery store, where you've got a summary real quickly where you can go through bullet points and maybe learn something and file it away if you're interested in that. So they'll recycle it through those, and all of a sudden there'll be 5 different articles and 5 different throwaways, all about the same subject, all written by the same person, and they count those as 5 independent references. So this is how the WPATH, the bibliography, comes about. Citations that are marginally related are used. They'll in the list, if you pay attention, they'll say something about chick oviduct bioassay in the castrated rat. And you think, well, what did that have to do with anything? Well, it looks scientific. It's got a Journal of Hormone Research. That's a really respectable journal. Gosh, look at that reference. That's a really powerful one, when it has very little to do with anything in the actual subject matter. So you can make yourself a 270-item bibliography that looks really powerful. And if you look at a lot of what's done, it's a cut and paste. You can tell that the same articles are referenced when they do write their articles. And so it's a very poor science. They also have created, the WPATH has created its own Journal of Transgender Health. Now, this is supposed to be a peer-reviewed journal, okay? If you imagine that everyone who reviews it is a member of WPATH or believes in that, can you imagine the quality of the articles that you're going to find? Will anything in terms of contradiction to a transgender affirming concept be approved or published? Absolutely not. So but they have a medical society, so-called, and their own journal, and that gives them credibility. These things make a huge difference in the medical community. For my colleagues who are not in my subspecialty, they are totally dependent on this kind of appearance, thinking, wow, there's an international group that has its own peer-reviewed journal, and they say transgender issues need to be affirmed, and we need to do hormone treatment, and we need to do surgical treatment, and the sooner the better. This gives steam to the engine. If you wonder why we've gone from 0 to 60, it's because this kind of stuff is sweeping over the medical community, and the vast majority of my pediatric colleagues think it's absolutely total valid science. They have no idea what's behind the curtain. The other interesting thing is that their bibliography at WPATH now completely is devoid of any reference to Dr. Kenneth Zucker, who was the pioneer in gender identity disorder. His name has been expunged as if he's never existed.
So this is the true history of transgender, quote unquote, medicine. They took all of the medicine and the actual scientific studies out because those disproved what they were doing. And then they did this sort of pyramid scheme where they would, one person, they'd have one infiltrated doctor, he would write a report. Then in all these rag mags, they would have like 15 people cite that one medical report. And then the next person who wrote the article would cite those 15 articles as 15 different citations. And really there was nothing behind it. It's an empty pyramid scheme of nothing, bad science. And they not only expunged all of Dr. Zucker's transgender research, the actual science, but to this day, you see the California bill to ban conversion therapy. They're still doing it today because that's how cults work. They can't compete in the real field of ideas. So they have to ban and censor. That's what indoctrination is. That's the definition of indoctrination. Education means you get exposed to everything, and then you come to your conclusions based on facts and science. But they can't compete in the field of ideas because the truth isn't on their side. So still to this day, any remnant of people showing this science and trying to give humans the ability to make informed decisions instead of being completely mind controlled in their echo chamber, they are against. And yeah, California is passing this bill to ban conversion therapy based on their criminal scientific fraud. And you can go and check all of these facts out, and you can go and find these studies and see for yourself. This is the truth. But nobody can hear the truth. They're making it so nobody can hear the truth. You can only hear their lies. They're saying we're the fraud or whatever. And that's the difference between us and them. The truth is on our side. So we are like, fine, listen to their side, but listen to us as well. We're not trying to censor their side. We can debate it openly and win because the truth is on our side. It's the same way with Christ. I didn't come to Christ because I was kept in an echo chamber and everybody censored everything except the Bible and I was locked in a room with the Bible. No, I came up in the world. I came up in the public education, re-education camps, turning me against Jesus Christ and telling me all of that was false and feeding me all of this evolution and everything. But still, I was exposed to all of their ideas. Then I read the Quran, 3 different translations of the Quran. I studied all of the world religions. I read all of the Satanism books. I read Aleister Crowley's writings. I read the New Age. I actually got into the New Age for a little bit. I read their work. I didn't come to the knowledge of the truth because, oh, censor all the New Age and all the satanic information and all of the mainstream information. And no, that's what they do. That's what cults do. They ban and censor and isolate people from all ideas and thoughts besides their indoctrination. And that's what they're doing to this day. They expunged all of the scientific studies that showed the true data to create this empty pyramid scheme. And then to this very day, they're trying to seal it up and sew it up through banning what they've labeled conversion therapy, which is essentially preventing humans from making informed decisions, saying that you can't tell them any ideas besides our LGBT literature. It's against the law. It's criminal to expose them to other viewpoints. I mean, you can see right here, I'm showing you their own words right here. I'm not making this stuff up. You couldn't make this stuff up. This is like something from the 1984 novel. They're literally saying that they need to protect people from free thought. They're going to protect both children and adults from abusive, ineffective efforts. I mean, they show that they're a cult. They say outright, we do not believe humans should have the right to hear all ideas. We think they should be isolated to only our ideas. This guy here is like, hey, I'm the king, I'm the gods, and I've decided that what I believe is the only thing people should hear. And it labels everything that contradicts him as abusive. It's abusive for people to be able to, educate themselves and have free thought and listen to all sides of the argument. He says that's abuse. It's mind-boggling that this is happening in our lifetimes. And I'm sure this guy's so brainwashed, he believes that. I'm sure he believes that it's abuse for anyone to hear anything except what he believes himself. Oh, the irony. While they preach tolerance, oh, we should be more tolerant and embrace diversity. Oh, but don't tolerate anything except what I believe. That's what he's saying. But I don't tolerate anything except my own personal beliefs. I don't tolerate any dissenting opinions from what I believe. So don't get me wrong with the whole be tolerant thing. No, be intolerant. Be intolerant of Christians. Be intolerant of anybody who thinks differently than you. Absolutely. Be bigoted toward Christians to the point that you want to ban them, censor them, and criminalize them because they don't think exactly the way you do. I mean, it's beyond hypocrisy. I mean, to me, it's mental illness. It is, they're brainwashed in a cult. If you can't make the logical, reasonable connection, if you say you're being tolerant by being so intolerant that you want to criminalize people thinking differently than you, I mean, to me, that's mental illness. You're not functioning. You're not functioning in reality. So that's what moved forward and now is considered the norm in transgender counseling and all of that. But the truth behind it was this Nazi program, this breeding, this androgyne breeding program that they were doing on these children. You can go back and get, if you can weed through and throw away all the ragmag stuff that they're preaching in the transgender medicine now, and go back to the actual studies and look at them, the only scientific studies that were really done showed that almost every single person they did these procedures to, they did them against their will. These weren't people like they're leading you to believe, adults walking in and going, I've been trapped, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body my whole life, like Bruce Jenner and what they market to us in the media. No, these were little children that they changed against their will. And these people are still alive and you can do interviews with them. I'm going to play just an interview from Mr. E that he did with Jeremy James, because this is worldwide. This isn't just America. They were doing this program of changing people's sex against their will, children's sex against their will, all around the world. And there were pockets and communities, like I talked about New York and San Francisco and LA, and like Svali in the Black Awakening video, she talked about the pockets of the satanic covens in Virginia and in San Diego. There are pockets where they do this. So I'm going to let Jeremy James tell you what he witnessed coming up in his country.
How much it pervades the media, television, Hollywood, government, senior public service, senior figures in manufacturing, multinational companies. And these people would appear to be part of a club that stretches over several generations. And there are even people in it who don't realize what they are part of. As far as I can make out, there are people who are transgendered from childhood, who grew up, and in their eyes they're quite normal. But there are a great many who are co-opted into higher levels of this secret club. I mentioned in one of my papers, and I just mention this here because it's where I came across transgenderism back in the early 70s, at a time when this was utterly unknown.
Yeah.
I was working in the bank. I was only about aged 18. And there was a lady there who was very chatty. I had great conversations with her. A very pleasant person. And she was built like a man, walked like a man, had a slightly female voice, and over several months she got to trust me and became, willing to talk about issues that she wouldn't normally speak about with other people. And she said, when she was born, was a male. But when she was about age 2, she had an operation which turned her into a female.
Age 2?
And she was saying about age 2. This is as far as I can recall.
An operation.
And yes, and she said she found it very hard to adjust for many years to the fact that she was a girl. And she said her parents told her she had the operation because when she was born, there were question marks over her gender.
Yeah.
Now, you could reason from this, as I did at the time, she was some kind of hermaphrodite.
Yeah.
And that the doctors or the medical people finally recommended that she have an operation to have her assigned to a very specific gender. But other things she said to me, and I could only see this years later, indicate that she had been transgendered by her parents.
Wow.
You see? And in my place of work too, I worked in the Department of Finance in Dublin. I was there for about 30 years.
Wow.
And over the years, I'd met several people who were definitely, there was a huge gender problem, let's say. These were meant to be women, but you really had to strain your imagination to put them into the feminine bracket. Now, I'm not critical of these people, and you know, in the normal sense of speaking, they were good, kind people.
Oh, yeah.
But the point is, there was this underlying gender issue. And when I then came upon the transgender question after I was saved, I could relate back to what I'd learned.
Wow.
Because I'd come across some women who really, they were speaking with a male voice.
Yeah.
Equally, as a child, I could hear certain adults speaking with the male voice. As you get older, you don't hear it because you are conditioned to hear them as females. But as a little child, you could hear the male voice behind the female. And I think, you know, they are conditioning kids so early now that they won't see it. But in our day, I was born in 1955, I did notice that some women locally spoke like men. Another thing I noticed when I was growing up too, when I look at old photos of old-time Ireland and, you know, domestic scenes in farms in the 20s, 30s and 40s, quite often in a group setting at the back, you'd see that was definitely a man, but dressed as a woman.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh.
So I began to add it up, but it wasn't easy. Psychologically, the barrier against recognizing what's happening is immense. And I have great sympathy for people who have great difficulty accepting that this is going on and has been going on for many generations.
Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about on the bullet point from the Johns Hopkins doctor on his bullet point presentation is how they blame society. Okay, so this is where Kinsey comes in. That is based on Kinseyan psychology. That's exactly what his conclusion was in all of his sexual research, that we're all sexually repressed, and he blames society for the agony experienced by the patients. But anyway, his conclusion that has been taught in all of the universities and is cited here in these journals is that it's not wrong to do any of these things. What is wrong is society causes trauma and agony to the patients because they say it's wrong. It would be wrong to counsel a person to accept their own body, to come to terms with who they are as a human, biological, natural entity. That would be wrong, to give them any sort of treatment that might help them be themselves. No, his treatment is to spur them forward in the delusion and demonize anybody who wants to help them become comfortable in their own skin. And Kinsey wrote in his books that it's the same with incest and child rape, that he said that parents should be able to rape their own children because he said it's only the social taboo that makes it traumatizing on the people. He said that parents and other adults can have loving, mutual, fulfilling sexual experiences with their own children incestuously, and, you know, any children essentially. And he paid, like in one instance, he paid a father to rape his daughter, and also the grandfather to rape the same child, and to log the times and dates that they raped her and everything. And then Kinsey comes in, and this, I'll show you her in her own words. She's going to testify in just a second out of her own mouth. I'll put it on the screen and you can hear her tell that Kinsey would come in and sit her down, and this is how he got his data. And he would ask her in front of her rapists, "Do you love your daddy?" And she would be like, "Yes." So he wrote that in his notes. Yes, this is a mutually loving, fulfilling experience for both the father and the daughter. And that's how he got the data. And then he would ask the parents to fill out a form and say, you know, how did she respond during sex? And they, oh, she went into convulsions. And he says, okay, so she had an orgasm. And I'll show you the data out of his own book, where he says that one toddler had, I think it's 26 orgasms in a 24-hour period. I mean, that's unbelievable torture. He wrote this in his own book. He did. Nobody's saying he said this. He said this, published it in his own book, and society has somehow accepted this. I mean, so that toddler had round the clock, no sleep, sexual assault. So yeah, that's Kinseyan theory, to blame society for the agony experienced by the patients. He said incest is fine. This little girl enjoyed being raped by her father and grandfather. She says she loves them. So therefore, it's society's fault for making it taboo. That's what's causing trauma to this family. Pedophiles should be allowed to live as they wish. And that same Kinseyan philosophy has been used in the transgender movement. They aren't to deal at all with any sort of disassociation or any sort of delusions they have. No, they are to absolutely remain delusional and be prodded down that path into self-mutilation. And everybody around them has to also take part in their delusion, or else we are to blame. And that's the pervasive mentality, that Kinseyan mentality. You can see it in the GameStop transgender incident, where this guy, who's clearly a guy, walks into a GameStop and starts cussing and tearing up property, criminal destruction of property, and all of that, because this innocent employee, a young kid, looks at him and I mean, it's obviously a man, and it just says, you know, thank you, sir, being very kind. It's ma'am, give me your corporate number, and threatens him, tells him to take it outside, threatens to beat him. You know, he does all of this wrong and then says, give me your corporate number. You must be punished because you didn't take part in my delusion.
Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
I can call the police if you'd like me to. You need to settle down.
Motherfucker, take it outside. I need your corporate number. Because I'm going to call them and talk about how I was misgendered several times in this store. Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
So if you go into a GameStop in a kitty cat Halloween costume, the GameStop employee has to go meow, 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 meow. Oh, because I have to take part in a delusion that you think you're a cat. So I got to pretend you're a cat. So everywhere I go, I have to, you know, be conscious of taking part in everybody's mental delusions. It's ridiculous. But this is the mindset. They believe this 100%. This dude was like, give me your corporate number. How dare you be sane and perceptive and just carry on with your everyday life and interact with reality. And the kid was apologetic. I'm sorry. I'm just, you know, whatever. But it wasn't good enough. It wasn't the GameStop employee that was breaking merchandise and cussing F this and F that. No, the innocent GameStop employee became the perpetrator. That's the Kinseyan philosophy, because he was willing to take part in this guy's delusion, but he accidentally didn't. And so he's the perpetrator, and the guy who's causing all of the destruction of property and cussing and threatening people, he's the victim, because this innocent kid didn't play along with his delusion. So how do you know? How do you know at Halloween time what to do? Are they just in costumes, or is this one of these people who identifies as an animal now? And that's not just being snarky, although I enjoy being snarky. But yeah, trans man also identifies as a dog, going around wearing a tail. So if this person walks into GameStop or somewhere, I mean, we all have to take part in this delusion. I'm sorry. No, that doesn't make me a hater or anything. This is not a dog. This is a person dressed up as a dog. Why should I have to pretend to be insane and act like I can't perceive that that's a person dressed up like a dog? I mean, this is reality. We need a serious reality check. People have lost their minds.